Hey everyone, welcome back to the lab. In this video, we're going to be talking about F#, Giraffe, and HTMX with Giraffe.ViewEngine, which is the HTML DSL. So recently I've been building server-side rendered sites with F#, Giraffe, and HTMX. I've even gone so far as to dive into the world of HTML DSLs with Giraffe.ViewEngine, which I found to have surprisingly good developer experience and performance, and which is currently running this site. So some of these previous experiments are here, Giraffe.ViewEngine here, F# and HTMX, and in particular the interactive island pattern, which we'll be looking at today. And then several benchmarks I've run on all of these technologies to kind of just sanity check that this would actually work for a reasonable sized app. So long shallow pages and short deep pages, because actually the kind of HTML, the kind of page that you're rendering does have different performance properties. So in this post, we're going to put them all together to explore how to build apps with F# Giraffe using Giraffe.ViewEngine, that DSL, to actually render HTML in a type-safe fashion, and then using HTMX to give our HTML some superpowers. And so the specific question we're going to talk about is how can we just build sites with all of these technologies? Now note that we have covered a lot of these in depth previously, and so this is going to be a bit of a shorter one. I'm just kind of running through how to put these all together in this one recipe. So if you're interested in getting a deeper dive into any of these specific technologies, I recommend just checking out one of those other videos. Okay, so how are we going to do this? So in this post, we'll explore an example app that renders a table of random values and use HTMX to power pagination. And so this is basically what it's going to look like. We got our little F# Giraffe server, and we're going to render this page. And so when you come to the page, we're going to render obviously with a full GET request, and this is going to give you the full page. This is that experience we all know when you go to a website and it does its full render, takes a few seconds on first load, whatever it is. Now the HTMX part we're going to be doing is what I'm calling an interactive island, which is basically just a self-contained widget that we can re-render by itself, and it makes sense within the context of the page. So in this case, we're going to be rendering just a list of items, and the previous and next buttons are going to use HTMX to just re-render the part that we want to paginate. The rest can all stay the same. And this is a pretty simple, but I think very powerful way to use HTMX to empower your apps to be more modern. And so to this end, basically we have two targets. This is what HTMX calls them. You can think about it as a widget or an interactive island, as I mentioned. And the two targets that we might have is the main page. So if we get a full GET request or something, we need to render the main page. And then we have the sentinel page, which is this island right here, which is just the table with its pagination, and it can be rendered independently. And crucially, that actually makes sense within, the scope of this page. Okay, and so to kind of illustrate all this, we're going to be building an example project. If you've seen my other videos, this should look familiar. This is basically Cloudseed, the F# project boilerplate that I use to start basically all my projects, because it's a great foundation for basically anything. So we have our little data. We're just using a Postgres and a container, and then our main app, which is F# using the Giraffe web framework and EF core and dbup for any kind of data we're doing here. All we're doing is making random data and saving it and reading it out in a paginated fashion. So overkill for this, but I like building real, or at least semi-real apps. And this is where we'll be playing around here. We're using Giraffe.ViewEngine to actually produce this, HTML, and then we're going to be embedding HTMX attributes on this to make this an interactive island. So here's a list of all of these. Now I'm not going to be diving into a lot of these because this would, be too long. It's out of scope of the video. But I have a lot of different guides for these things if you want to learn more. So we got a guide on building web APIs with Giraffe, one for server-side rendering with Giraffe.ViewEngine, one for HTMX with the interactive islands pattern, one for F# and Entity Framework, and one for Dockerizing or containerizing, I guess, your F#.NET app with Docker. So if you want to learn more about any of these, check out those and you'll get a much better in-depth summary of how we're using them. All right, final thing to say before we go into how we're actually building this app is that the full project source code is available in my HAMY Labs example project repo, which is here, which includes dozens of different projects in a few different languages, and just showing how I build things. This is available to my Hyminian subscribers, so if you want to get access to that, check out this here. All right, on to building the app. So installing dependencies. We need to install and access a few dependencies for our purposes of building an HTMX UI with Giraffe. So for our F# Giraffe app, we need Giraffe, which is going to be our web server. So our way of, getting requests on the server, turning it into useful data that we can use to get things off the request, actually return the HTML, stuff like that. You can use a different web server. There's like many different good ones in F# land and a ton in C# land, which for the most part is compatible with F#. But I like Giraffe, and some of the code here, mostly just getting data off the request, is Giraffe specific. So just note, if you go with another thing, you'd have to like change just a little bit of the code that at least connects the two. Get this via NuGet, and this is the GitHub repo here, which is all that information. The next thing we need is Giraffe.ViewEngine, GitHub repos here, which is just this standalone HTML DSL, which I currently like over just building raw HTML or using templating, because we actually get a lot of F# type safety out of this, which I think is great. If we're going to use F#, we might as well use the type system, which is one of its best properties, and we can do that pretty easily with the DSL. And finally, you can use this package if you want, which basically just provides some HTMX helpers for this DSL. I'll note that I didn't get this working currently because I'm running .NET 7, and I think it has an implicit dependency on .NET 8, and so there's a little bit of mismatch, but I'm sure we'll get that figured out in the next several weeks. So even if you are on .NET 7, don't be scared of using this. I think it is a really great package. Okay, so that's the F# Giraffe side. And then for HTMX, all we got to do is just, get it from a CDN here using our script tag. Currently we're on 199, but who knows, it might be different. So just go to HTMX website and get the latest thing. And you can just plop it in your HTML page. And that's, I guess, the beauty of JavaScript, is it is pretty easy to install. Okay, next we're going to talk about routing to full versus partial targets. So with our dependencies installed, we can move on to building the app. The first thing we need to do is figure out routing. Routing is important because a normal HTML app only has a single render target per page, the whole page, but HTMX allows us to have multiple. So we need a way to tell if the request wants the entire page or just a single part of it. And so I'm basically calling this routing. I mean, you can imagine that like on a normal web page, the routing you have is like the URL to the thing that you're rendering. And, you have props and URL parameters that tell you, I guess, exactly what you want to render. But usually it's like just the props are kind of just focusing on the data that's going to be in the page. And so with HTMX, we have an extra layer of a little bit of complexity. Though I think we can manage it pretty well, where, you have your URL, which is going to a handler, but now we actually have this other routing where inside the handler, we need to know what part of that page did you want. And so the way that I'm thinking about this now is targets as interactive islands, which I think is a bit coarse-grained, but I think this is a very simple scalable system where it feels a bit coarse. It feels a bit maybe not powerful because it doesn't have quite the flexibility you might get if you could kind of cut this out into like very thin, super precise widgets. But I think in the long term, this kind of simplicity and kind of guardrails gives you all the flexibility you want without the complexity pit of failure that I think you get with a lot of this precision. So that's my idea. That's what I've been running with and testing. But would love to hear other people's thoughts of how they're kind of dealing with this, because this is a new paradigm. So I don't know if we've, exactly found the best practices yet. So the way that I've been thinking about this is targets as interactive islands. So a page may have a few sections or widgets on the page that we may want to fetch dynamically. Each of these is a target or interactive island. So far, I've found success keeping them pretty large and self-contained because it's just simpler that way. And so I would expect, like on any page, that you would only have some number of subsections that actually need this, like probably less than 10, I would say. And I think if you do that and you keep these sections really self-contained, really kind of coarse and low number, this makes this very simple, very fast, very performant. And so this is a simple scalable system, I think, at scale. Okay, so for routing, we're going to use the HX request and HX target headers to see if this is an HTMX request and if it wants a specific target, respectively. If so, we'll try to parse this into an enum we know about so that we can utilize F# type system and match operators to route to the appropriate target with type safety. And so this is kind of what I'm talking about, is like, HTML markup, etc., is like kind of like untyped strings and stuff like that. But if we're in our DSLs, if we're in our F# app, we can really lean on the power of the type safety and kind of push any of this translation from untyped to typed to the edges and kind of contain that complexity. And then it allows us in basically all of our application code to build with F#'s incredible type system and get all the nice things from that, like match operators, build time errors, and things like that, which I found to be really great to actually code in. Okay, so let's look at some code. So first, let's start with the enums declaring the targets on our page. Note that string enum, which I'm using here, is a workaround I built to get string backed enum-like behavior in F# since it's not supported natively. So we're not going to dive into this here because I've already talked about it extensively. So if you want to learn more about strenum, check it out here. But basically, it's just a little type I got that allows you to go from enum to string and string to enum. That's all it does. And so here's that code in my code editor. We got our targets here. This is just an enum. And then we've got strenum of main page targets. And all I'm doing is saying, hey, when I get an enum, I need a match statement to go from what is the enum to the string. And because we're using this match statement, if I were to add one here and miss it, we would get a warning saying that like, hey, you didn't cover everything, which again is allowing us to contain that complexity, contain the room for error between the untyped and typed land. Okay, so we've got that. Next, we'll look at how we are parsing this from the Giraffe request. So we get the HTTP context, which is what actually gives us access to the request data in Giraffe. We're going to look at the HX request and HX target headers. And then if they both exist, then we're going to try to parse it into that strenum that we had earlier. So here's the code here. And then we'll look at it in my editor so that we've got some highlighting. So we got get target from context. We're getting that strenum in here that we were using earlier. And then we get the context here so that we can actually access the request data. And it's going to return prime A option, which here is the targets enum that we declared earlier. Here we're just getting the HX request off the context. We're saying, hey, if we don't have it, then we just return none. We know that there is no target. If it is an HTMX request, it may or may not have a target. So we still need to see if that exists. If it exists, then we're going to try to turn it into something we know about. And if we don't know about it, we're just going to drop it because, there's always the possibility that someone's sending us junk payloads that we don't want to handle. And so that's how we're doing that. Now we're going to utilize this helper in the HTTP handler, which is kind of like a controller in other web frameworks. You might have like a controller with like the registered thing. The way that I like to do this in Giraffe is I route from the Giraffe to an HTTP handler, which will do any kinds of like processing of like data or headers or any kind of the stuff like that. And then we can turn it into a fully typed props. And then that flows into our actual application code in a fully typed manner so that we are, again, containing the complexity of going from untyped to typed. Okay, and we have that code here, and here it is in the editor. So all we're doing here is passing in the service tree, which is how I do dependency injection. This is just a HTTP handler, which is a Giraffe context or construct that is basically turning into a middleware, something that can handle an HTTP request. Here we're getting the page number from the context, which is looking at that parameter. Here we're using the target function I showed you earlier to actually get what the target is. And here we're converting all of this into type say props that will pass to the renderer down here. Here we're looking at the target and we're saying, hey, if we got a target from our context, we're just going to pass that down. But if we didn't get a target, then we still want to give, the renderer this information so that it knows what to do. And we know for this URL, for this handler, that if we don't have one, then we actually want to revert to the default, which is the full page. All right, now on to rendering targets. So now that we know which target the request is trying to render, we can route that information to return the appropriate HTML or markup. In this main page renderer, we are creating new example data so that we have something to actually show you in the app. We are fetching paginated example data from our database. We're rendering both the Sentinel table and the full page targets, and then we're selectively returning the target based on the request props we parsed. And so here's that code here and in the editor. So here we're just getting in the dependencies we have and the props, and here we can see the props that we filled in earlier. Just a target, the page that we're on, and then Sentinel count, which is really just the page size, so that we know how to do pagination. First thing we're doing is creating that sample data. Then we're reading out our paginated data from the database. We're throwing if we don't have that or it failed in some way. We are rendering our table component, which returns XML node, which is how this HTML DSL Giraffe.ViewEngine is building up HTML. Each kind of target or each tag is basically an XML node. And then from there, we're building up the full page. And so we can see that we've got our HTML, we've got our head, we've got our script tag for HTMX. This is how we're getting it in the page. We set some meta stuff, our title, we create a body, we create an H1 Sentinels table, and then we are just plopping in the Sentinel table markup that we got from this helper, which we'll talk about in a second. But the main thing I want to show you here is that based on the target target, this is how we are selectively rendering which part of the markup we want. So if you just wanted the Sentinel table, we're just going to return the Sentinel table. And if you wanted the full page, which again is the default, if we don't have an HX target, then we're going to return this template here, which is this. All right, now let's look at the Sentinel table target to see how we're using HTMX to give it superpowers. So this is going to contain the Sentinel table itself, which is rendering the target. And then note that it's using this ID. So we're converting the enum to the string, which is its ID, to uniquely identify this. And so this is how we're uniquely identifying this as an interactive island. And this is how, when we're communicating to the server, we're going to know which island it's referring to. The next thing we have is Sentinel table pagination. These could be in the same, markup, but I just separated them out so it's easier to read. And this is going to render the previous or next buttons. And this is really how we are giving hypermedia controls to this target and allowing it to give those HTMX requests. And so the code is here, but we'll look in my editor. And so let's actually start with the table itself. So we have our table component here, takes in some props, which is just whether it has a next page, what page number it's on, and the list of sentinels. And so it's fetching its Sentinel ID or its target ID from that strenum that we had earlier. And it's going to create a div and it's going to put that ID on itself. And so this is how it's uniquely identifying itself as I am this target, I am this interactive island. We're creating a table, we're giving it its header row. And then what we're doing is using yields here to basically flatten the list of sentinels. So we're saying for every sentinel, we want you to create a row and fill it in with this information and then flatten it here, which we just need to do because this is a list. Now under this table, we are creating our pagination, which we'll talk about in a second. And this is where the controls are for our HTMX. And then we're just creating a little div at the bottom so that we have our page number. Okay, and now let's look at the pagination up here. So the props it has, this is an anonymous object. It just has next and page because that's all we need. It's again going to get its table ID again from that strenum that we created earlier. And I have a note here. So I was trying to use Giraffe.ViewEngine.htmx, and I mentioned this earlier. I'm in .NET 7. Currently it's having issues. .NET 8 just came out, so I think a lot of packages tried to upgrade and they haven't figured out all the dependencies. So I'm not actually using this in this example, but I did have what it would look like here just in case you're curious. So we're creating a div here and then we're saying like, hey, if props.page is less than 1, then we don't want to render the previous button because there's nothing previous to 0. But if we're over that, then we do have a previous page so that we want to have the previous button. And so we're creating a button and we're giving it a few attributes. So here we've got our hx get, which says like, where would this request go to? We're just giving it the URL to our current page. This could probably be more type safe, but I think this is simple enough to read. And then we're saying the page will be whatever page we are on -1. We're giving it an HX target, which is saying what should I replace the returned HTML with? Like, where should I put it? And we're giving it the Sentinel table ID, which remember is on top of the table. And so this is one of the reasons why I think these kind of like coarse grained widgets or interactive islands is a good way to deal with HTMX, because we're going to have a lot of this, like, where does the HTML go? And if we're kind of reaching around the page to like change different parts, I think this gets really unwieldy. But if we're just using this for simple interactive islands where it's like, hey, just replace yourself, just update yourself, I think this goes really, really far for building, real mature complex apps. So that's, one of the main reasons why I think this is such a powerful paradigm for this. And then the final thing we're doing is saying hx push URL, which means, hey, after you make this request, I want you to put this in the history. And this is so like when you go to like page 5, we are updating the windows. So if you want to use back buttons or forward buttons, you can do that. The has next button is basically the same. Only thing that's different is, obviously it's the next button and we're using a plus instead of a minus. And then if you're looking at this, these extensions should be really easy to see. It's hx get, hx target, hx push URL, which corresponds to all these. But just note that, it's really easy to set custom attributes with Giraffe.ViewEngine. It's really just one extra call here. And that's it. As I was making this, I just realized that I don't think I showed you the actual demo of this. So let me just go over here. This is the page. I've got it running. I'm in my editor there. Localhost 5001. And so I just did a full reload. And so we can see that, this did its full reload guy. It loaded a few things. And then these are just like extension things. And then when I go next and previous, we're rendering the paginated data. And all of these are created by HTMX. and we can see that it's not reloading the full page. We're not getting any flash. And we can also tell here that, the amount of payload we're getting from the network is smaller than we were on the full page. So we're only rendering partials here. So hopefully that makes sense. We've got a full F# Giraffe app rendered with Giraffe.ViewEngine generated HTML and empowered with HTMX. So I've been having a pretty good time building with server-side rendered UIs, and we'll probably be making some larger projects in the coming weeks. I found it's very simple, very easy to work with, has all the type safety that I like, and it's actually very fast and powerful. So I'm kind of excited to explore what we can do with this, and if there's better patterns, easier patterns for doing this stuff. If you like this post, you might be interested in a few other ones. So more on the interactive island paradigm I've been talking about here, as well as F# and HTMX in kind of raw string land if you don't like HTML DSLs. How I built a simple markdown blog with F# and Giraffe, which is also the core of what my site is running on now. And then if you're just new to Giraffe, new to F#, you might just want to look at build a simple F# web API with Giraffe to get started. And finally, if you're looking to build your next app with Giraffe, or really with F#, you might consider Cloudseed, my F# project boilerplate, which uses a lot of these core technologies I used in this example app to give you a good foundation. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.